Welcome, everyone. I'm John Haskell, the director of the Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. We welcome you to the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center was established 20 years ago at the library to connect scholarship and policymaking and the interested public. With respect to our author today, Ivan Krastev, the connection is real. Ivan was the Kluge Center's Kissinger Chair in International Relations and Foreign Policy in 2018 and 19, and he finished The Light That Failed, the book that we're going to talk about while in residence here, a co-authored book with Stephen Holmes. We are proud to have him back. The Light That Failed is getting broad acclaim here, and it already has received great acclaim internationally, and was recently among 5 books shortlisted for the Lionel Gelber Prize, which rewards the best nonfiction work on foreign affairs. It's sold about 30,000 copies, I think, in Germany already. It was released first in Europe, and it got the top books of 2019 in the Financial Times and the Guardian, I believe. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Correct me.
Economist, yeah.
Yeah.
Financial Times Economist.
And it'll be coming out in, I think, 20 languages in the course of the next year or so. So it's, we encourage you, of course, to buy the book. And after the event, Ivan will chat with you and sign your book. We'll be selling the books out about and back, but we'll have people to direct you if you're interested in doing that. The reception won't go anywhere while you're out there buying the book, so I encourage you to do that. Many of us in this room, I'm sure, read widely on the challenges facing liberal democracy in the West. And in my view, Ivan's book does a remarkable job of connecting illiberalism in Eastern Europe, the Putin phenomenon, the rise of President Trump in the US, and the sudden emergence of China as an emerging superpower. But perhaps the greatest contribution of the book is its clear-eyed take on where liberal democracies went wrong and how they've contributed, usually unwittingly, to the rise of illiberalism in Eastern Europe and within their own borders. As we talk about this book, I'm going to kind of follow the storyline more or less that you and Stephen developed. Let's start with Eastern Europe. Something you call the, quote, imitation imperative is central to the thesis of the book. What is that, particularly with respect to the former Soviet bloc countries?
Thank you very much first for coming, and thank you very much for the Kluge Center. If you find any interesting pages in this book, it's either basically the idea of Stephen Holmes, who is not here, or it was written when I was in the Kluge Center. And also, I very much want to thank Mark Plattner, the editor of Journal of Democracy, who is here, because the first publication concerning our idea about imitation basically was there. Listen, in 1913, the theater hit in Vienna was George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion. And I don't know, do you remember the plot of the play, but this is the story of a very poor flower girl where a professor in phonetics took a bet that he can learn her to speak like a queen and to be accepted in a high society. And he won the bet. And the story is that in a certain way, in 1989, the world looked very much like a stage in which Pygmalion is going to be staged politically. It was the end of the Cold War. There were 2 universalist ideologies that have been clashing with each other, and one of them basically committed a suicide. And there was only one political model which was worth imitating. So this is, in my view, this was the major story of the end of history idea that came from Francis Fukuyama. It was not that everybody is going to become like America. It was not that everybody is going to become democratic, but to be democratic and capitalist was synonymous of being modern. Modernity was the other name of democratic capitalism. And from this point of view, for Central and East Europeans, the idea was we're going to imitate the West. I'm saying this because now people are saying, oh, this was very much the imposition of the West on the East. It's not exactly the case. I'm Bulgarian. I was 25 years old in 1989. We wanted to be like the West. We wanted to have your institutions, of course, prosperity. We wanted to be the West. And the story is what happened, and this is the East European story, which basically what I want to tell is that in Eastern Europe, the idea of 1989, the word that was most quoted politically, just after the end of the communist system was normality. We want to be normal. And to be normal means to be like the West. Future was not anymore ahead in time. Future was next to you in space. The future of Poland was Germany. And this idea of normality was very powerful. This is why the idea was we don't want to experiment. The problem with the imitation is, and this is our major argument, is that first, imitation is part of any human development. There was a French 19th century sociologist, Tardet, who said, imitation is another word for society. But now this was, you're imitating a model, the whole model. Secondly, you're imitating it in front of the West, and the division between the models and the imitators became the most important model. So the West all the time is telling you how well you're imitating them. And this was particularly true during the European accession process, in which basically Brussels is saying you're almost 53% like us. You have 27% more. As a result of it, in my view, three things happened. And from this point of view, when Frank Fukuyama was talking about the end of history, for him, the process of imitating the West was a kind of a harmonious process. He believed that it's not going to be very exciting to live at the end of history, but it's not going to be highly antagonistic. But at the same time, imagine, when you want to imitate somebody, the first thing is that you acknowledge that he's better than you. If I want to be like you, what's the problem with me? Second, if I want to be like you in a certain way, I want also to take your place. And this antagonistic nature of the imitation, in my view, was slightly neglected in different analyses for the rise of illiberal political parties and governments in Central and Eastern Europe. But if you're reading carefully, Mr. Orban or Law and Justice Party in Poland, they're making a very strong point. We don't want to imitate anymore. We want to be ourselves. For example, there is a famous Hungarian historian very close to Mr. Orban who said, we don't want to be like the Germans or like the French. We want to be like ourselves. So this resentment towards imitation, of position of being imitator in a world in which everybody is telling you that it's great to be original, is something that was totally absent from this story. And the second thing which is absent to explain particularly the East European shift to illiberalism is the demographic story, which now
well, let's stick with Orban for a second.
Yeah.
Because his trajectory, if you follow his trajectory, which
yeah.
you all get into in the book, you track a lot of what you're saying. I mean, yeah. What's his history? I mean, how did he get to the point where he is today?
Listen, he's a particularly interesting case because when you talk, in his case, illiberalism means he's an ex-liberal. And in the way, basically, to a great extent, communism was delegitimized by ex-communists. Part of the problem of the liberalism in Eastern Europe was very much the result of the work of ex-liberals. So Viktor Orban is coming from a very humble background. He's coming from a kind of a poor family. They used to have a running water in their house for the first time when he was 14 years old. So he was not particularly interested in politics when he was younger. He was very much interested in football. And I'm saying this because many of these kind of populist leaders that you're talking today, they have been very much socialized through sports. This is true for Mr. Erdogan, who also dreamed to become a footballer and so on. So the idea is that victory, you're either winning or losing. So he started as a leader of a very young liberal party, and he was very much part of this imitation of imperative in 1994. And then his major accusation was, liberalism does not understand power, he said. It's not a win-win game. For me to win, somebody should lose. And he started to make it very strong point about this kind of a nature of the political process. He started to concentrate power. And the most important thing about these people is they don't believe that they're a neutral institution. Every institution which is not controlled by me, obviously is controlled by my opponent. If I'm not controlling the court, then the opposition is controlling the court. If I'm not controlling the media, then the opposition is controlling the media. And this kind of a much more Carl Schmittian vision of politics as the clash between friends and enemies was this trajectory. And he had 2 points which very much equaled with the Hungarian public. Listen, in 2008, 2009, Hungary was very much struck by the financial crisis. 1 million Hungarians have borrowed money in Swiss francs. And then basically the devaluation of the forint, and their basically loans became 40% higher. This was the middle class people who have borrowed in order to buy apartments. They were going to lose their apartments. And then he came and said, I'm going to fix by degree the interest rate between the Swiss franc, exchange rate between Swiss franc and the Hungarian forint. And the foreign banks had huge losses. But the Hungarian middle class said, this saved us. We're going to keep our apartments. And as a result of it, the idea that in order to do something, somebody should lose, this side, it was the international banks. But this idea that the only way to win is to have an enemy very much come there. And after that, you start to reproduce the enemy. Then the enemy was the refugees. I'm always giving this example, but you should understand it, that there was a lot of people who went through Hungary, but Hungarians didn't see much refugees because these people are going basically through the railway stations. There was a study being done by the Hungarian government, opinion poll, which shows that more Hungarians declare that in their life they have seen unidentified flying objects than those who believe that they have personally met a refugee. But then, which does not, this is different than the situation in places like Germany or Austria, where you have a lot of people basically living there. These people are going through the country. And as a result of it, you start to go with this kind of, you're mobilizing public opinion. For example, you know that 90% of the people were quite hostile towards the refugees. From this point of view, Hungary was not different than any of the Central and East European countries. And then he organized a referendum. Normally, you ask people on a referendum when you don't know where their opinion is. But you're using the referendum only as the way to mobilize certain type of a story. And now, for example, the refugee story is over and the migrant story, the new campaign is against the Roma minority. So from this point of view, this idea of a polarized politics, but this is a polarization by design. You're polarizing. And this is what came, this is the story. Viktor Orban is an extremely gifted politician. He's a very high risk taker. For example, he betted the President Trump he took the Trump side in June 2016. I do believe that 80% of the Republicans didn't bet on Trump in 2016. He did it. By the way, this was a risk. And I'm saying this because from this point of view, it's quite important to understand the logic of this type of politics, yeah.
So you mentioned a minute ago, and you cover in your book, one of these, really a fundamental question of political philosophy, where liberal democracy glorifies open competition. But what do you do when open competition leads to an Orban?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no real answer to that question, but that's a challenge, or a paradox, I guess, when the person who opposes it actually wins, gains power.
This is a great question. In 1848, when the universal male suffrage came to France, there was a very important poster of this moment, and in the poster there is a worker who has a rifle in one hand and ballot in the other. And the interpretation was ballot for the class enemy, bullet for the national enemy. Part of the problem of the competition in the democratic societies is the two parties compete, but there is something that keeps you together. And what keeps you together, and during the Cold War it was very important, is that a war can come. And the way you're competing and voting against each other, you should be next to each other if the war starts. I do believe paradoxically, one of the things that happened to the Western democracies is that this type of cohesion, which came from social policies, that came also out of this unity that comes through kind of a critical experiences that the wars, is not there anymore. And if you see some of the political leaders that we're writing about, they much more behave like civil war leaders. They believe that the domestic political opponent is a much bigger problem, for example, than the external enemy. In a certain way, this is something that, in my view, has fundamentally changed, and this makes democracy not so much more competitive, but much more divisive than it was before.
So before we get to, I have a couple of questions about Putin, because that's kind of your next chapter. But before we get there, you were about to raise the issue of demographic change and how that affected the politics of Eastern and Central Europe, and how it differently affected the politics in a place like Poland, for example, and some of the others.
Listen, this is an interesting story, because if you go and read, and a lot of interesting stuff has been written about the illiberal turns of Central and Eastern Europe, there are two schools of thought. One is very much economic. They said, this is the mobilization of the losers of the post-communist transition. To some extent, it's true. To some extent, it's not. I'm going to tell you why. And the second is, it's about backsliding. It's a very popular term now in political science, is talking about democratic backsliding. Backsliding is a religious term which comes from the time of the Spanish Inquisition. And it was about the baptized Jews who went back to their bad habits. So the idea is you're trying to transform and basically go with these East Europeans, but they're always going back where they were. Our argument was different. You can explain through economic argument the rise of Viktor Orban. It's much more difficult to explain what happened in Poland. For the last 30 years, the GDP of Poland tripled. The country did not have a recession since 1992. This is the fastest developing European economy in the last 30 years. The social inequality in Poland has declined in the last 10 years. And 70% of the polls declared that they're satisfied with their individual lives. Then the question is, why people who are doing so well basically vote for parties who are so angry? Where the anger come from? And here is where the demographic argument is critically important. Demographically, Central and Eastern Europe is the fastest shrinking part of the world. Low fertility rates, combined with not too high and too long life expectancies, and a high level of out-migration. For the last 30 years, Central and Eastern Europe has lost 18 million people. If it was a country, this country was going to be as big as the Czech Republic and Hungary put together. So many of this country, around 20% of the population is left. And this is creating a situation in which I'm just going to give you the Romanian data. Romania is a country of around 21, 22 million people, one of the big Central and East European countries. Just for the last years, 10 years, between 2007 and 2017, 3.4 million people has left the country. 70% of them are younger than 40 years. So you end up with aging societies where the kids are not around, the doctors are not around, and even if you're doing fine, but basically you see that all others want to leave, this creates the situation and the feeling of loss. And this is why this kind of a demographic factor was very difficult to be spelled out, because when today you ask East Europeans in every single country, what is the best thing that happened to you after 1989? They're going to see the opening of the borders. What worries you most? The opening of the borders. And this is why even the hostility towards refugees and migrants is set in a way, is a replacement. This is a trauma of those that have left. And I do believe this part of the story was something that normally is totally ignored in the way people are trying to understand Central and East European stories. And I do believe that in this book, we try to make this much more central argument than normally it is taken.
So switching gears to Russia, which is in many respects a story of Putin, as you all describe it. How did he exploit the weaknesses of the West, and what was his imitation imperative? It's not the same as the one in Eastern Europe.
It's an interesting story because, in my view, there are two things about Russia which normally people neglect. The first is Soviet Union collapsed, and the Russians didn't understand why and how. But this is true. It became very quickly. You don't know. Secondly, many Russians were very happy for communism to go. But very few of them were very happy for Soviet Union to go. It's different. From outside, people believe that everybody who is against communism should be happy with disintegration of the Soviet Union. For Russians, this was not the case. They were a great power. They wanted basically, they had their people there. I do believe, and this is not the accusation of triumphalism about the West in the early 1990s, to be honest, is not accurate. If you read the titles of the books that have been published immediately after the end of the Cold War, you're not going to see much of a triumphalism. You're going to see a lot of uncertainty. For example, a classical Cold Warrior like Zbigniew Brzezinski, the title of his book was Out of Control. Ken Jowett, The New World Disorder. So many people, and particularly old Bush administration, was very much aware that we're seeing a change that should be handled. It's not something to be celebrated. And the West tried to do everything possible to tell to the Russians, you are victorious too. It is not the victory of the United States over Russia. This is the victory of the West and the Russian people over communism. It didn't manage to work for two reasons. First, in the 1990s, Russia lost 1/3 of its GDP. The life expectancies in the country declined 7 years. In a period of 10 years, basically, people start dying. The level of suicides was very high. There was a major kind of a loss of not simply incomes, but social status, and so on. And in the crisis of 1998, destroyed the first financial crisis, destroyed basically the first generation of the Russian middle class, which was one of the initial supporters of the changes. And then came the war in Yugoslavia, and particularly NATO operation in Kosovo. And then even the pretension that Russia is a great power was not there anymore. Russia said we're strongly against the war, and the NATO told them, it's your problem. And they could do nothing, because there was totally asymmetry. The fact that Russia was a great power was much more the decision of the West to pretend that this was the case in 1999 than it was there. And here comes President Putin. He came at the moment in which the prices of oil started to go up. Russian economy paradoxically benefited very much from the financial crisis because you have a much more production. And the Russian imitation of the West was very different than East Europeans. Russia never believed that they want to be like the West because they never believe that they can have democratization as a kind of a successful process in a long time, because it's a country traumatized by revolution and a civil war. And the fear of disintegration, the fear of divisiveness is very strong. So in the beginning, they start to imitate democracy and democratic institutions for purposes slightly different than the ones that we usually talk. So go back to the 2004. And the question that we ask in the book is the following. Why President Putin is rigging elections, which otherwise he was going to win if they were free and fair? And secondly, why he's rigging them in the way that everybody knows that they're rigged? Because it's not a very subtle type of a rigging of the elections, like put it. The famous joke in Russia is that there are three things, if you're Russian, that you don't choose. Your parents, the place where you're born, and your president. So from this point of view, the story, but why he's doing this? In 2004, all of his opponents will agree that if the elections were free and fair, he was going to win. The country was doing better financially. There was a weak opposition. And our major argument is that the famous Russian talk about managed democracy is not so much faking democracy, it's faking management. And the story is, there are 5 reasons in which this type of rigged elections, which nobody protests, helps those in power. First, you use elections to show that there is no alternative to President Putin. He's competing against the leader of the Communist Party, which is not a highly charismatic figure, let's put it like this. Like the leader, Mr. Zhirinovsky, who is not particularly sane. So from this point of view, you look around, and he looks as if this is the only person, because he's not allowing other people to run. You're creating a story in which you basically are saying there is no alternative. Secondly, on the Russian presidential elections, you're not choosing president, but some governors can lose their job. Because you're using the elections to try to see how much your governors are controlling the situation. Can they bring people to vote? Thirdly, because Russia was traumatized by the disintegration of the Soviet Union, there are parts of Russia like Chechnya and so on that was very much in their way out at a certain point of history. And then you end up on the night of the elections and you see that Chechnya is voting 99% for the president. And this idea of unity, psychologically, you go back and say the situation is under control. So from this point of view, elections played a very important result. And this system was reproduced, and the source of legitimacy was, it's a rigged elections, everybody knows that they're rigged, but people are not protesting. And then came the protests of 2011, 2012. It was a regime change, but not the regime change we all expected, because suddenly President Putin understood that this type of system cannot work anymore. So when people said, occupy the squares, occupy the streets, he said, better occupy Crimea. And from this point of view, foreign policy became very important for the legitimacy of the regime. But the moment when it happens, he starts to imitate the United States in a totally different level. There is an imitation in which you're imitating in order to show that the model that you are imitating is not worth imitating. You are trying to use imitation as a subversive technology. I'm just going to give you 2 examples. When the Russian president read a statement about the recognition of Crimea, he used the whole paragraph of the statement of the NATO recognition of Kosovo. He was talking all the time about human rights, the rights of the people for self-determination. So you're mocking the language of your opponent to say there is no difference between us. You're about geopolitical interest. We are about geopolitical interest. There is no values. Or the second story, which was very much shocking to people. In the first 48 hours after the Russian special forces went in Crimea, Russian president personally said there are no Russian troops in Crimea. Politicians lie, but normally they lie about things that is difficult to be proved. In this kind of a world in which we are living, 3 hours after he made the statement, American or German policy makers, they knew the names of the people. That why they're doing this? Why you're lying like this? He lied in order to be called a liar and said, a liar like you. What about the weapons for mass destruction in Iraq? The major message is we are not different. And secondly, I'm lying. What you can do to us? And from this point of view, this idea of a kind of imitating, I'm trying to do what I do believe that you are doing in order to show that we are not so different, this is at the heart of this type of imitation used as an instrument to delegitimize the liberal order without being pushed to give an alternative to it. You're not saying what you exactly want. You're not coming with a different normative base. For example, when Soviets were around, they were saying, we are better. Putin is not saying we are better than you. We're saying we're the same. And to be honest, this works very well with the public, particularly when people go cynical, when they believe anything. They said, okay, he's about power, they're about power. And the moment when this moral kind of equality starts, this already basically is destroying the foundation on which liberal world is
and what you're raising is it's a thread that goes through the book is the concept of hypocrisy and how illiberals use it to show moral equivalence. I wanted to read a quote that ties into Russian elections. You wrote, popularity in Russia is a consequence, not a cause of the power one wields.
There is a beautiful story to tell on this, which you're going to like. A Russian colleague of mine was telling me about the interview that he did with a voter before the 1996 elections in Russia. So he said, who is your favorite politician? And she said, Mr. Zyuganov, the leader of the Communist Party. So he said, so you're going to vote on the elections for Mr. Zyuganov? She said, no, I'm going to vote for President Yeltsin. But why you are not voting for for Mr. Zyuganov? I'm going to vote for Zyuganov when he's a president.
So we're going to switch gears to the United States. We can come back to Russia. We're going to switch gears to the United States for a second. And let me read you something that you wrote, or you can disavow it and say that Stephen wrote it. The most exceptional thing about Mr. Trump's exceptional presidency is his rejection of the myth of American exceptionalism. He's accomplished something which would have been previously thought impossible. He has reconciled America's most jingoistic citizens to the idea that America can be, quote, great, end quote, without being an international leader, without being morally superior, without being especially innocent, and without having any right to lecture other countries. So we're great without being the shining city on the hill in some sense.
For us, it was very important because people, particularly, and it was easier for me than for Stephen Holmes, because when you're American, basically you take President Trump slightly more personal than when you're Bulgarian. And the story is the following. We know, and as we talk about Eastern Europe, we know why the imitators could be kind of disturbed by the age of imitations. Why they imitated. How it happened. President Trump came and told to the American public, for the last 30 years, which everybody believes was the American age, America is the biggest loser. Listen, this is not, and many of the American public said, you're right. So he touched on something. And I'm going to give you an example of something that for us was very important. Suddenly, many Americans, absolutely normal people, it has nothing to do with this and that, started to believe that some of the advantages of the United States in the world are becoming America's vulnerability. Let's give you the biggest advantage, that everybody is learning English these days. So for 3 decades, this was perceived as the best demonstration of the American power. You go there, you're framing the conversation. But then suddenly you realize 4 consequences of the fact that everybody is learning English. The first is that as a result of it, Americans are not learning foreign languages anymore. Why to learn foreign language when basically others are going to learn English anyway? Secondly, you go to the world, you talk to people who speak English, and you believe that you understand the places in which you are. But believe me, in Bulgaria, not everybody speaks English. And the views of those who speak English does not always coincide with those who do not speak English. So suddenly, you start to be kind of trapped in your own popularity. And thirdly, because everybody speaks English, suddenly, any type of a terrorist or radical can come here, can basically hire a plane, and do something in the country. It's not so easy for American to go, for example, in some of the places in the Middle East, and to do the same operation, because America became transparent for the world. Well, part of the world remains very opaque to America. And of course, there was also the economic part of the story, in which President Trump came and said, listen, what is this liberal order in which the biggest commercial winner is an illiberal power like China? And for us, it was very important, because in a certain way, this idea of America being great again is not America being the morally superiority. It's not the idea of the city on the hill. The message is, the problem is not to be better than others. It's enough to be stronger than others. And this is different, because American exceptionalism was very much part of what the country is. I'm always joking that somebody should run a campaign on Make America, America Again. Because from this point of view, the perception of America, the way that America was perceived as being different. Because, for example, there is many places in the world, you have genocide, you have awful things happening. Bulgarians, we never said what we can do about it. One reason is that we are smaller, that probably we're less powerful, but the other is we don't have this idea of mission about the world, that everything bad happening somewhere concerns us. And nevertheless, that people could be from time to time cynical and even ridiculing the United States, the world always relied on the fact that they're going to be part of American society, also because it's a kind of a migrant society, people coming from everywhere who said, listen, we can do something, we should do something. And suddenly, it's not there anymore. And I do believe that this is a kind of a radical change. I don't believe how long this change is going to be. I don't believe this is forever and so on. But I do believe that when we try to see what President Trump did, he did this. And from this point of view, his position coincided with many people from the left, which for years have been saying, we're not better than others, we don't have the right to lecture others, we should basically stay home. So this was some of the story that basically which we have been trying to tell.
So, and you're telling a story, at least in part, about how the elites of both parties have missed something in President Trump's approach to politics, and that many of us Washington Post readers who might be in this room like to think there's some reasonable middle ground. You guys suggest that should easily, we ought to be able to just sit down in a room and figure it out, which might be naive. And for many people that I speak to, I know one of the things that bothers them about the president is the lying, which you mentioned that before about Putin, but the fact checker in the Washington Post finds thousands of untruths since he's been president. You wrote about it. Trump's most zealous fans are wholly indifferent to revelations that his statements are very often inaccurate because they believe that these statements are sincere and thus true in a deeper sense. It's like the ultimate. People used to call
absolutely.
the elderly among us remember that Reagan was the Teflon president, but this is a whole other level.
No, it's different, and it's very important because for us, and here it was easier for me to make this line than for Stephen, who is much more kind of suffering of this. If you basically believe that the system is unfair, President Trump coming and saying, okay, I'm not saying the truth from time to time, but I'm not saying the truth for the same reason the Democrat is saying the truth, because this is in my interest. So from this point of view, his major message is everything that I'm doing and the others are doing is just because it's in my interest. They're not saying the truth because they believe in truth, but because it works for them. And this type of an argument, and this is why the biggest problem, and it's not only President Trump, you have the same basically with leaders in Europe and other places. It's not the lies, it's the half-truths. For example, you're going and saying, the judiciary, everything that is happening in judiciary is pure politics. So in order to defend the judicial power, the other side is going to say, no, it's not true. There is nothing political in the judiciary. And we know that both of these are not true.
Chief Justice said
the Chief Justice said, it's not true. There is no Bush judges, and they're not Obama judges. They're just totally kind of a neutral American judges, and they're Bush judges, and they're Obama judges, and people know this, and as a result of it, you're pushing others to defend the system with an arguments which are also not 100% true because they're normative arguments, and people know that in democratic politics. And I do believe this is eroding very much the system. And there was a great, by the way, article which Journal of Democracy published, and the story is people believe in democratic principles. Why then they are not critical and they're not punishing their leaders when they're violating the democratic rules? And the answer of the colleague who wrote the article was, because you believe that the other party coming to power is the biggest threat to democracy. I'm not going to punish my own leaders, not because I don't know that they're violating the norms, but because for me the end of the democracy is the other party winning. And this logic of polarization makes this absurd situation in which the overwhelming majority of the people still believe and stand for certain type of democratic values, but at the same time, they are not ready basically to punish their political leaders for violating them.
Mm-hmm. So let's switch gears to China now. They have you guys suggest that they have an imitation imperative as well. What are they trying to achieve? What is their imperative, and what is China trying to achieve?
First, for those who are specialists on China, our China chapter is very thin. Because none of us...
It's everything in there, right?
No, the story is that none of us is a real specialist on China, but China was important for us for the argument. Because we claimed that China was never part of the age of imitation. They have been borrowing, they have never been imitating. They're always insisting that everything that they're doing is with the Chinese characteristics. And this was part of their identity in a certain way. If you go back to 1989 and to Tiananmen, the major story is we're not going to allow to imitate the West. This was the moment in which the protesters in Tiananmen made a kind of a small model copy of the Statue of Liberty. That the decision was taken, they want to be like America, we don't want to be like America. And as a result of it, we're making a point which is China wants to dominate the world, but it's very different, both from the Soviet Union and from the United States in the Cold War. China is not interested simply to populate the world with its own replicas for two reasons. First, because unlike the Russians who politically has an inferiority complex, China has a superiority complex. They don't believe that others can really imitate them. It's an old empire and so on. But secondly, because China in the 1970s was exporting communism much more than Soviet Union did. Mao was really kind of aggressively exporting the model, and they saw the resistance, they saw the dark side of it. So from this point of view, the China model is, we are not interested for you to be like us. We are interested for you to do what we are telling you to do. So if you want basically to elect your government, do it. But the problem is that there are 4 or 5 things that are important for us, and here you should follow. And from this point of view, we're making there a difference between how the United States knows the world and how China knows the world. United States basically knows the world to the extent that people from all over the world comes to America and you're making out of them Americans, the famous melting pot. So America knows the world by transforming it. For us, the opposite to melting pot is the Chinatown. Chinatowns does not want to basically change the big cities in which they are, but they want first to keep their identity, and they try to exploit as much possible the opportunities, particularly economic, out of it. So from this point of view, we do believe that there's going to be a major power competition between the United States, particularly, and China, but we don't believe that this is the return to the classical Cold War. Soviet Union had a universalist ideology. They have claim on the future. They believe that the world is going to be like them, if not in 50 years, in 100 years. And the liberal world also has a universalist claim because both of them are coming from the European Enlightenment. They said, we are the future. The world is going to be like us. Well, for the Chinese, basically, it's much more power politics. And we found one interesting detail. During the Cold War, as you remember, the moon was one of the symbolic places in which the Soviets and the Americans have been competing. There is a famous joke from the Soviet period about an American calling to the president and said, Mr. President, from NASA we are seeing what is happening. Russians landed on the moon and they painted the moon red. What should we do? And the president said, wait, now we're going to land and we're going to write Coca-Cola there. The problem is that the Chinese, just in the beginning of the last year, when I was still in Kluge Center, made a special missions and they discovered so-called the dark side of the moon. This is the side of the moon that you can see only after the Americans and the Russians landed there. So the story was, we are not competing with you about the Cold War moon, because we went on the other side of the moon. And in my view, this was a kind of a symbolic story, basically telling the story that the next competition, great power competition, is going to have slightly different nature than the Cold War. So this is the reason that China is there. This is why one Bulgarian who does not know China and one American who is not specialized on China decided to end up on the China node. And also I want to tell you one thing about the title, The Light That Failed, because in my previous book, which was called After Europe, there was a huge accusation that the book is pessimistic. Listen, Bulgarians were not very famous for optimism, but also I cannot understand because both optimists and pessimists believe that they know what is going to happen. And one of the paradoxes of the post-Cold War world is that as a result of something that nobody expected, I mean the end of the Soviet Union, because nobody expected it, then everybody believes that we know what's going to happen in the future. So as a result of it, we took the title, The Light That Failed, which is the title of the first novel of Kipling. And what is nice about the novel, it's about love story and so on, is that it has 2 versions. His mother told him, I want happy end novel. And he was a good son. So one of the versions is short and with a happy end. But then he was not in a good mood. So there is a version which is longer and with not so happy end. And we said, our publisher is not going to allow us to have 2 versions of the book. So let's at least play with the title, and people can basically choose for themselves to read it as an optimistic or pessimistic book.
So that's going to lead me, before we get to your questions, so maybe we'll get a feel for what you've just said. Sounds a little like Little Women, actually. Yeah. But anyway, we believe that the end of the age of imitation will spell either tragedy or hope, depending on how liberals manage to make sense of their post-Cold War experience. We can endlessly mourn the globally dominant liberal order that we have lost, or we can celebrate our return to a world of perpetually jostling political alternatives, realizing that a chastised liberalism, having recovered from its unrealistic and self-defeating aspirations to global hegemony, remains the political idea most at home in the 21st century. So it's our choice to celebrate rather than mourn.
Yeah, absolutely, because there was a colleague of ours, which we have been talking a lot during writing the book, Ken Jowett, very well-known professor from Berkeley now. He's retired, and he had this famous saying. He said, normally history is a protestant. They're different forms coexisting to each other, but they're Catholic moments in which everybody basically is focused on certain institutional form and universal aspiration. So from this point of view, the 1989 and the period that comes was this Catholic moment. Basically, everybody was about liberal democracy. So we're back to Protestantism, which means that there are going to be liberal democracies and there are going to be others too.
All righty. Indicate to me, if you, right over here, Andrew.
Hi, my name is Angelica Vaughan. I'm a student at UCLA. I wanted to ask you, the 2018 Armenian Revolution, Velvet Revolution, was a rare win for democracy. Do you have any comments on that?
I didn't hear you. The what?
The 2018 Armenian Velvet Revolution was a huge win for democracy. Do you have any comments on that?
Listen, this is what I don't know Armenia, so from this point of view, to tell you something that you know better than me, I do believe that, and this is one of the interesting stories, that when the problem of the imitation democracy came, there was a, in my view, extremely gifted Russian political scientist, Dmitry Furman, who said, listen, what is the imitation democracy? These are kind of authoritarian regimes dressed in democratic clothes. But what people don't understand is that clothes can change the person. And when you have an elections, you never know when this type of a fake elections are going to trigger a genuine political change. And if you have the color revolutions all over the post-Soviet space, this was the case. And from this point of view, I do believe that the fact that there was this election process in places like Armenia make it easier to trigger this type of a popular mobilization that we saw in 2018. How easily this is going to be transformed into a much more sustainable democratic regime, I'm sure that you know better than me. So I'll do what I was saying in the book that the West should do, not lecture people on things that they know better than you.
We have right over here, Andrew. Then we'll go back there.
I was just curious, can you name any world leader right now, not just in the Eastern Bloc, but anywhere that maybe is not following this pattern?
Listen, there are political leaders in small countries that personally I have a strong respect for, but of course it's a difference between being a leader of a country of 10 million and being a leader of a great power.
What about France?
Now listen, to be absolutely honest, President Macron is politically different than President Trump, but they have much in common. Both of them are disruptive leaders. Both of them, and I do believe that, I'm not saying this in a negative way, they do believe that the status quo is not going to be preserved in the way it is. They see the change in a different direction, but if you're going to see, it's not by accident that even on things like NATO and so on, these people who otherwise are perceived as totally on different positions, they're going to agree. So from this point of view, I never had a problem with a strong and kind of a controversial leaders. I do believe democracy needs leaders. The problem is that you should not allow these people to focus all the power. Because the problem when people focus all the power is that you cannot be sure that it's going to be returned to the people. We have these debates, what is the democracy and so on, and I always go with the most minimalist definition, which come from Adam Przeworski and others, saying democracy is a political regime in which government can lose elections. And from this point of view, for this to happen, you need a judicial system, you need free media, which can allow the government to lose elections. Because in the period between 1788, the first democratic elections here, and 2088, 577 times power has changed as a result of a military coup. 554 times it was changed as a result of the elections. In all the elections that have taken part in this quite big period, only 1 in 5 times the opposition is winning. So in my view, in order to understand how the democratic regime works, it's very important to understand the state of the opposition. Paradoxically, the state and the strengths of the opposition is much more telling you about the nature of the regime than the nature of the ruling party or the nature of the leader. So from this point of view, I don't see any unrealistic that the executive power is trying basically to get stronger and to expand. The problem is others have enough power to stop them. Because to believe that you're going to have these entitled leaders, Eastern Europe for a while, the first 10 years, was very much run by people who were not particularly interested in power. For them, it was much more symbolic. Václav Havel is the best example of this. Listen, he was an intellectual. He was not there for power. But in politics, people cannot, like this, can stay only in the extraordinary moment and only for a while. Politics is about getting votes. The problem is that the opposition should be strong, so when people start disliking the government, they could be able to change it. And from this point of view, this is it. I see the personalization of power as a trend. By the way, I see also a trend which you see both in authoritarian regime and in democratic regime, and this is much more your physical family is becoming part of governing the country. Your son, your wife, son-in-law. Turkey is one of the great examples. This is also a return to a kind of an earlier form, and it's very much the understanding of the idea of the loyalty, whom you trust. There is an interesting Dutch prime minister, talking about names. I have a huge respect for Rutte. He was always the head of a difficult coalitions. He was always, for him, Chinese has this good saying. They said, to govern these days is not like hammering a nail, but basically keeping a balance on a thin ice. And you have these people who manage to balance interests, to find a common, to push compromises. I have a respect for these leaders. Even leaders that work very kind of particularly successful in a certain period of time, after that it can reconsider. You see the major crisis now in the Christian Democratic Party in Germany. We don't know, for example, strong politicians like Chancellor Merkel, how she's going to be remembered, to be honest. I have a personal lot of respect, and I have met her many times, but she's not doing at the moment well for her party. She could be, years after this, people can say, probably she missed the moment to leave, and so on and so on. So, but democracy is never based on one single person, because having even a strong leader, Russia is a great example of this. Mr. Putin is so much everywhere that people cannot imagine how post-Putin Russia is going to look like. And this is a problem. In a certain way, he's kind of closing the door for the future. You believe that, as one of his advisors and now Speaker of the Parliament, he said, if there is no Putin, there is no Russia. Listen, he's a mortal person. Do you really believe that the mortal person, that if he's not there, Russia is not going to be there? I do believe this was the most anti-Russian statement ever made.
You got a question right over there, Michael.
Hi, my name is Boyko Antonov, and I'm also a Bulgarian. Last time you've been here, you described a very interesting position on Brexit. Many of us have been surprised by your analysis. What will be your explanation after this happened?
It's a great question. To be absolutely true, I was surprised by many things in politics. I never expected that Brexit is going to be reversed after the Brits voted. This is one of the few questions on which our family earned some wine, basically betting on people. The interesting story about Brexit is that there are two totally different groups of people who went there. On one side, you have, of course, particularly part of out of London, very much English countryside, that are nostalgic for different periods. And they have a good argument to claim that they have been abandoned, because it's going to come to surprise for you. But quite a big number of the poorest regions in Europe are in the United Kingdom. At average, United Kingdom works great because London works great. But if you go to some of the places like Sheffield and others, you're going to see really, there was when people were trying to understand what are the major factors that are going to determine how people are going to vote, it appeared that loss of communication with the big cities, for example, small towns which lost their buses to go, for example, to London, loss of population, are critically important. So you have this story. At the same time, you have a global elite. You have people like Boris Johnson who believes that Europe is not global enough, that if basically United Kingdom stays part of European Union, and if European Union is going to have a crisis, United Kingdom is going to lose. How these two groups are going to go together is difficult. I was always saying that for the moment, for the last 3 years, European Union was consolidated by what we saw in the United Kingdom, and this is true. The Prime Minister of Albania made a comment which was very important on this. He said, when I see Westminster these days, it is not much more different than the Bosnian parliament. And this is very important because particularly for East Europeans, for us Brits were different. By the way, even more than the Americans. They have been Democrats for centuries, their institutions worked, and so on and so on. So to say to them that you are not different than us is the worst that you can say. But I do believe in the next 3, 4, 5 years, Britain is going to be more consolidated than European Union. It's going to change because now when you start to discuss concrete policies, programs, and so on, European Union is going to be much more divided than Britain. And my last point on Brexit.
So you are now predicting the future, though.
I'm speculating. There is a difference between predicting and speculating. There is an irony. Second half of 20th century, Britain was all the time in a trade negotiations with the former colonies that want to get independent. And it was a very asymmetrical negotiations. All the expertise on the British side, and what the others had was passion for independence. And now with respect to the European Union, this asymmetry is totally changed. Because for the last 40 years, Britain has never been negotiating any type of a trade deals, because all trade deals was negotiated by Brussels. So now Britain is ending up in a position of its former colonies. It has a passion of independence, and all the trade expertise is on the Brussels side to the extent that Britain borrowed from New Zealand trade experts in order to go to negotiations, because you need thousands and thousands of people to negotiate the break with the European Union. So from this point of view, no, speculation is not predicting.
We have one last question, right over there, Mike, this person right here. He's right here, yeah.
Let's finish positive. I was born before World War II in Germany. We are grateful and thankful for the Americans and the Allies who gave us democracy. And I was very happy that you didn't give us the American presidency system, so we could develop in Europe our own way of democracy. During the years, I have established 2 high-tech companies in the United States. And I have understood during these years that the United States is a powerful, wealthy, big island. And you understand this thing with the island even more when you listen to your politicians from the left and the right who all want to have America great again, which is totally stupid because you are a great country and a very successful country. That you have deficits in your trade balance, this is clear because you are a wealthy big island. You really don't need export.
So let's do you have a question, or we can have Ivan comment?
Yeah.
We can have him comment if you'd like.
Okay. The question is an answer. The United States have to start to export. And when you want to export, you have to play at the rest of the world. So you have to change your voltage to 20 volt, 50 hertz. You have to go away from your internet.
That's good. We'll let Ivan comment on that. Thank you.
No, just one sentence. Listen, America probably is an island. seen from America, many of the European countries are like cruise ships, who is a kind of a tourist going around. But I do believe that in the world that is coming, for many reasons, there should be a new balance in the relations between the United States and Europe. And I do believe America should change, Europe should change too. Our sense was that certain period is over. I'm not sure what's going to happen next. We were joking with Stephen Holmes always that future is the invasion of the unknown. But it does not mean that Europe and America does not have a common fate in this new world coming. And the problem is to figure out how it looks like.
Thank you very much, Ivan.
Thank
It was
you
a
very much.
positive finish.